Okay, good morning, everybody. So we pick up on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. We're in the last parak, fourth parak of Masechet Beitza. Started yesterday. We started talking towards the end of the share. We got onto the sugya of carrying on Yom Tov l'tzarech shelo l'tzarech. There's a little bit of a machloket rishonim as to whether one's allowed to carry in a situation where there is no need for it. We've learned earlier the sugya of mitoch. But all would agree there needs to be some need, even if it's not a bona fide Yom Tov need, but some need in order to perform it. In any event, there was a question which comes up. Question comes up. Balach Lamaisa, if you're in a place that has no eruv, and you need to carry your keys. So on Shabbat, obviously you can't do that. So on Shabbat you have to have a key belt or whatever it was. On Yom Tov, you'd be allowed to carry your key because there's no melacha of carrying, and it's l'tzorach Yom Tov. But the question is asked: what happens if you have on your keychain all sorts of other keys that you don't need for Yom Tov? Would you be allowed to carry those? So it's brought the Shema Shabbat Kilchata. I didn't have a chance to look it up again, but I believe he brings it in a footnote. Quotes from, I think it's Rav Moshe Feinstein, who has a tshuva relating to one who carries a box of cigarettes. So I'll preface this with saying that nowadays we know a lot more about smoking than we did back then. And according to many poskim, it's absolutely forbidden to smoke. I remember a few years ago, Art Scroll brought out a Minchas Asher, Rav Asher Weiss wrote a Haggadah, beautiful Haggadah. And Art Scroll brought out a translation of the Haggadah. Now, in the original Haggadah, so there are about 30 different essays on different halachic topics, right? There's the Haggadah is one section, and the other section is the halachic essay. So when they translated it into English, so as you know, English takes up a lot more words than Hebrew, so they didn't have space to put in all the essays. They put in one halachic essay, one essay. What do you think was the most important topic relating to Pesach that they chose to publish in the Haggadah? And that was a question about smoking. So the question was asked about whether cigarettes are chametz. So I remember Rav Asher Weiss, right? It says, first of all, you're not allowed to smoke anytime because it's so bad for your health. He says, second of all, if you are going to be smoking, you're not allowed to smoke on Yom Tov because it's not shaver kol nefesh nowadays. Okay, now that you know that that's Vasur and that's Asur, so we'll discuss the question of whether it's a problem of chametz, which it's not, but you're not allowed to anyway. But in any event, so going back a number of years, a number of decades, when it wasn't so clear and it was a much more common habit in terms of smoking. So there's a question: if somebody was carrying a cigarette box, and you only need one of the cigarettes, could you carry the whole box? So Moshe Feinstein writes that yes, you could carry the whole box because that's a ribui b'shiurim. Essentially, you only need one, but you could use any one when you're carrying all the cigarettes. You don't know which one you're going to use. So there were those who wanted to compare that to the keys and say in the same way that you're allowed to carry one cigarette, you're allowed to carry the whole box. You're allowed to carry one key, you're allowed to carry the whole keychain. Problem with that comparison is that it's a little bit tenuous because there, all the cigarettes are the same thing. The other keys are not all the same key, meaning there's only one key that you need to use. If it's not gonna help you if you use the wrong key. So therefore, if one is in a situation, if one is in a place without an Eruv, it's not so clear that one should be carrying all the different keys on the keychain, certainly on Yom Tov, certainly on Shabbat. One should just have the key that they need. Okay, be that as it may. So we are in the Gemara and Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. We saw yesterday the discussion about carrying based on the Mishnah. We saw the discussion that somebody is carrying large items and large bundles, etc. It needs to be done in a way that it doesn't appear like the way the one carries on Chol, on a weekday. So therefore, you have to do it in a little bit of a different way. And we saw the Gemara said different ideas, different ways of making a shino in terms of the way the one is carrying. But we said, mutar. If there's no way to do it differently, so long as you're carrying for Yom Tov need, then it would be permitted. So let's pick up. We are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the top of the page. 7 lines from the top of the Amud, right? Daf Lamed Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, it says, Dam Amar, im efshar leshanot mutar. That's what we said yesterday. If you can't change from the way that you're carrying, so then that would be allowed. Again, we're talking on Yom Tov, and the issue that we're discussing is whether it's a bit of uvdin dechol, whether it looks like the normal weekday way of carrying. So, Amarle Rav Chanan Barava Rav Ashi. Now we have a couple of statements that Rav Chanan Barava says to Rav Ashi. So he says, Amur Abanan, Kama de'efshar l'shanuye mishaninam b'yom ha'tova. Let's just express in a different way what we've already said, which is saying that we said The rabbi said, "Kamadev shalashanu, yeah, as much as you can change, right? Meshaninan b'yom tov. We're talking about carrying loads on Yom Tov. You need to change from the normal way of doing this." So now he asks a question. He says, that being the case, the hane nashe the kamalyan chatzbayu maya b'yom tava v'lo kamshaninan v'lo minanu v'lo mide. So he says we have a case. It's very very common that you have these women who come and they bring their buckets. Right, they fill up their buckets with water, and they do it in the normal way. They come to the wherever it is, to the well, to the fountain, whatever, and they load up their buckets with water. They do it in the usual way. They don't change anything. And we see that nobody says anything. Nobody gives them any tochacha. Nobody says you're doing the wrong way. Nobody says you have to change. Okay. Whenever you read a Gemara like this, it makes us very, very grateful and thankful that we live in an age when we have running water. Nobody has to run off to the well and fill up their buckets, etc. But this was a big deal. This is something for most of history that people had to do to go and fill up their water. Right? And on Yom Tov, so again, on Shabbat you can't do it. On Shabbat you would have to go and fill it up beforehand. But on Yom Tov you can go and you can carry out and fill up. You need water. You need for all sorts of things. And we said you should change things. You're going and you're carrying your loads and doing burdens. This is very much a weekday activity. So why is it that they don't? Right, Rashi says. Rashi, you'll see, is a little bit further down, about halfway down the Amud. Is Malyan Maya. Shavod Maya Min Nahar. They go to the river to fill up their water. Okay, wherever it is. So why do they do that in the ordinary fashion? So says the Gemara, this is going to be exactly the case of Ev Shalosh Hanot. You're going to say they have to make a shinui. What is the shinui that you would like them to do? Let's see. It says, right, so we said, we have these women who go and they fill up their buckets from the river of water on Yom Tov, and they don't make any shinui in the way they fill up. We don't say anything. So he said, because it's lo efsha. There's no shinoi that can be made. Hey chaliyavid, what do you want them to do? What's the shinoi? Right? The malya b'chatzba lava. Here, obviously, it's not a case. You're going to say they fill up with their right hand, fill up with their left hand. You very much need both hands to fill up the water. So if we say that ordinarily, you're going to say if they normally go and fill up with a large bucket, so let them go and take a small bucket so that it's an ikar. In the same way we said that if you're carrying the jugs of wine, you can carry the individual jugs. You can't carry the big crate with all the jugs inside. Okay, so normally you fill up with a large bucket, let them go with a small bucket. If you're going to say that, well, you can't say that. Why? Right. So then you're going to make them do extra journeys. Meaning, if you're going to say that the change is instead of taking your large bucket to the river, take your small bucket, so you're going to have to walk back 5 times rather than doing it in one go. So you're actually increasing the torach and you're increasing the burden. So that doesn't make sense. Okay. What about if we say b'chatz bazuta? What if normally on a Yom Chol, on a week that they would go and they would fill up with a small bucket. Tamale b'chatz b'lava. So let them now go and use a large bucket. Again, the point is that it's different, that it's a shinoi that's recognizable. Well, kamaf sheba masoi. Well, in that case, that doesn't help because then you're increasing the torach in a different way. You're increasing how much they have to carry.
Rabbi
Kenigsberg. The that you make is going to increase the burden. What?
Can I ask a question? The examples given here are all events in public. It's not at home, it's in public. Is the part of the motivation for making a change the idea that there's an element of marit ayin here? In other words, that people may think that you're not aware that it's Yom Tov, something like that.
Right. That's a good question. The answer is probably yes. That's probably part of it. Meaning, when we're dealing with all these things, which appear to be weekday activities, that's right. Right, you're doing it in that's clear and that seems and that appears both to you and to anybody else that this is not a Yom Tov need. I think that is part of the element. Yes. Um, Okay, but so in this case, there's nothing that you can do. Remember all the cases we saw yesterday, and this is perhaps why Rashi was careful to point out to us that in all the shinuyim, all the different changes that we saw, it was a shinui that would decrease the Torah, that would decrease the amount of exertion that you had to expend. And then there were certain cases we said that it's not decreasing the exertion, but at least it's not increasing. Yeah, either you're increasing the amount of times that you have to walk, you're increasing the amount of how difficult it is to carry the water. And therefore, there's no change that you can make that makes sense. Therefore, you just do it in the ordinary way, and that's you need water, so you need water. So that's what you can do. So goes on with a few more examples. So it says you can't change from a large bucket to a small bucket. You can't change from a small bucket to a large bucket. Okay, what about the following? Says the Gemara. Uh, Tichse, and now we have a couple of different girsaot over here, which is an interesting story as well. But it says Tichse benichtama. Okay, so why don't you cover it up? Cover up the buckets or the jugs that you are filling with the water. Right? That would be a shinoi. Normally they aren't covered. Rashi says Tichse benichtama kisui shel etz hasui lekadin. Excuse me. Okay. So he says cover with a kisoi shel etz hasoi lekadin. This is a wooden lid that you would have for these jugs. So says the Gemara, no. Tisei v'nachma zimnin tenafil v'ati le'atuye. Says don't do that because you are going to. Sometimes it's going to fall. Sometimes it's going to fall, and then you're going to have to carry them. Okay, so interesting. So that line, by the way, it seems Rashi does not have that line in his Girsa. Because according to Rashi, if you would be carrying, the point is when you're carrying the lid, what's the Gemara saying? When you're carrying the lids on top of the buckets, that would be part of the need for Yom Tov, because that's part of the way that you're making a shiur, and it's part of the way that you need to carry the water. So that itself is going to be a Yom Tov need. But if the lids fall off, and then you're just carrying them by themselves, there's actually no need for that. Now, although it's not a Yom Tov need, again, according to Rashi's opinion, you'd still be allowed to carry it on Yom Tov. According to Tosfot, maybe not. So that's why Rashi doesn't actually have this line in his Girsa, because it doesn't make sense according to his Shita. But nonetheless, that's other Rishonim. So this would be a problem. So we say you can't make a shiur by covering it up because sometimes these lids are going to fall off. You have to carry them by themselves. Okay. La lemikter. Right. The mafsik v'ati lemikter. Okay, and you're gonna have to. Sorry. Zimnin danafel va'ati la'tuya. Right. Sometimes you're going to have to come and you're going to have to carry it up. So then it says tiktere. Okay. So if that's the problem, it's going to fall off. So tie it on. Tie the cover onto the bucket for Yom Tov, so it won't fall off. So zimnin the mafsik va'ati lemikter. Well, that's going to be a problem as well because sometimes then it's going to become disconnected, right? And you're going to have to tie it again. And tying that itself is going to be that's a melacha that we're not going to allow on Yom Tov. So that's also going to be a problem. Rashi says, yeah, zimnin the mafsik, right? Shetzarech lekoshro shelo yipol b'derech. You're going to need to tie it again, so it won't fall out on the way. Zimnin the mafsik be'elichato. V'ati lemikshele. Sometimes when you're walking, it's going to become untied, right? And then you're going to have to tie it again. V'kesher asoy latkin av melachau. This is you're tying this in order to fix it, in order to permanently attach it. This is going to be an av melacha, and that's not allowed. Okay, so another suggestion, which is similar to what we saw above, in terms of how to make a shinui here. Tifros sudra ilave. So take a sheet and cover up. It's not a cover for each jug, but you take a sheet and you're going to cover up the jugs or the barrels that you're carrying. Right? Tifros sudra ilave. Zimnin demitmish b'maya va'ati lidei schita. So this is going to be another problem because sometimes then if you're going to put a sheet on top, so sometimes it's going to get wet. It's going to fall into the water. And then what's going to happen? You have this sheet which is wet. You're going to take it. You're going to want to wring it out. But you can't wring it out because that is going to be the melacha of melaben. And that's going to be an isur of squeezing and of schita, etc. We spoke about this, by the way, if this sounds familiar. We spoke about this in the Tzur Bashir. Everything's always connected. That's the way Torah works. So we spoke about this last week I was in here, but the week before, when we spoke about the question sugya of carrying umbrellas on Shabbat, right? And we saw, if you missed it, you can follow the shiur on YouTube. But we saw that we don't carry umbrellas on Shabbat, and there's a whole discussion as to why. And there was an opinion that actually says there was Rav Mashash, if I'm not mistaken, who said that under extenuating circumstances, he would actually support carrying an umbrella because what is the alternative? He said, again, this is a minority opinion. We don't pass in this way, but it's very interesting halachic logic. He says he says that carrying the umbrella, that he saw the prohibition. It's not actually so clear what it was. Again, that was the shiur over there, but nowadays we say that we don't. But essentially, the reason that we don't carry an umbrella on Shabbat is more because of minhag than anything else. So he says if somebody finds themselves in a situation where they're going to get very, very wet, and their clothes are going to get very wet, they're going to come home, they're going to come to wring out their clothes, and that would be an isur doraita. So he says, therefore, better to use the umbrella so you won't come to wring out your clothes. So that's interesting. Again, we don't use umbrellas on Shabbat, but this idea we do have explicit Gemarot that talk about wringing out one's clothes, and here wringing out the sheet that would be a problem. Okay, so at the end of the day, right, Zimnin to midmish b'maya, v'ativ day schita, you're going to come to wring it out. Kach lo efshar. That's the conclusion. Lo efshar. There's no way the situation of trying to come and draw out the water in the buckets from the river. You do it in the normal way because it's too complicated. There's no feasible way to find a shinoi. Okay, that's what it means. Lo efshar. Next, another statement of Amalei Rabba Bar. We're about just before halfway down the Amud. Amalei Rabba Bar Rav Chanin leAbaye. Another statement of Rabbi Chanin. Last time he spoke, he said it was to Rav Ashi. Here he says to Abaye. Okay, he says the following: Tanan, ein metapchim, vein mesapkin, vein melakdin. Okay, this is I'm going to allow myself to say it's a relatively famous Gemara. This is a very relevant halachic sugya as well. What we learn is, and really it's a Mishnah in Shabbat, right? Tanan, and we'll see it later on as well. Ein metapchin vein mesapkin vein melaktin. Okay, so what does that mean? These are different ways of different types of sort of clapping, right? Ein metapchin is really is clever. Rashi says ein metapchin mishum shir or mishum ever. So why would you be clapping your hands? Because of singing or because of mourning? Okay, Tosfot takes issue with that. He says, no, this is all because of shir. But anyway, what does metapchim mean? So Rashi says, metapchim means yadav zol azol. When you clap your hands one to another. Okay? Ve'ein mesapkin. Mesapkin, he says, kaf al yerech. That's you take your sort of clapping your hand against your knee. Right? Ve'ein meraktim, sort of dancing. Baregel. Okay, says Rashi, v'kulam ne'esru. All of these are forbidden. Why? Mishum shvut. It's an Isur Rabbanan. It's a shvut. There's no melacha of clapping your hands, but there's an Isur Rabbanan of clapping your hands according to a rhythm. Why? Gzera shema yetakein klei shir b'perek meshilin. So we'll see it later on in the Masechet, but we see it here as well. That the reason is that you may come to fix musical instruments, and therefore this is the reason why you can't play musical instruments. Even we say, yeah, you're not going to have to clap your hands or clap, etc. Whenever you're clapping to a beat, and then you want the music to accompany it, you're going to come to fix the musical instruments, and therefore Chazal said that would be an Isur D'Oraita, and therefore Chazal said you can't do that. Now Tosfot over here says, you see Tosfot says Tanan. Okay, it's about a bit past halfway down. Tosfot says Tanan ein metapchim ve'ein melaktin. Piresh Rashi shema yitakein klei shir. So we're concerned. Rashi said that you're going to come and fix musical instruments. But umiu ledidan shali. Says Tosfot, for us nowadays this is no longer forbidden. This is going to be permitted. Why? The dafka b'mehen. It was only in their days. Shu b'kiyin lasot klei shir. They knew how to make musical instruments. Right? Everybody got broken, needed to be fixed. Everybody knew how to do that. So therefore, shayach lemigza. Therefore, it makes sense to make this decree. Avaladidan We, says Tosfot, and I would extend to us, I believe nowadays, we don't know how do we, right? We aren't really concerned. If your musical instrument's broken, what are you going to do? You're going to take it to somebody who fixes musical instruments, but you're not going to do anything. And therefore, and therefore we don't extend the gzera. So this opens up a whole sugya for us, right? Which is, we saw at the beginning of the Masechet the question of davar she'nesab minyan, something that was established right by the Sanhedrin, or saying it was established by a Beit Din, much greater authoritative Beit Din. They made a decree. At what point do we say that decree no longer applies? Generally speaking, we understand. We say batel tam lo batel takana. We have a gzera of Chazal, we have a takana, we have an enactment of Chazal. It was done for a certain reason. Even though that reason no longer applies, the gzera would still apply. Give an example. Right? We don't take for a person who is not ill, a healthy person who just has a mechush ba'alma does not take medicine on Shabbat. Why don't we take medicine? Because we have a gzera of shchikat samamanim. I think we've spoken about this in the past. The gzera is of grinding. That in their days, the way they would make medicine, they would take herbs and leaves and whatever it is, and they would grind them together, and that's how they would make their medicine. So Chazal said, if we're going to allow anyone to take medicine on Shabbat, you're going to come to make the medicine, and therefore that's going to be forbidden. That again, that applies to a healthy person, somebody who is sick, and even a cholesha ein bo sakana, no question, a cholesha yesh bo sakana, but a cholesha ein bo sakana, somebody who's bedridden or is seriously ill or is taking antibiotics or whatever it is, takes regular medication, continue taking medication on Shabbat. There's no question. But somebody who's not actually sick but just feels a little bit, and wants to maybe take a pill, that's not so clear. That would be forbidden because of the Gzera of Shechekat Shamanim. So you could say, well, nowadays, nobody's going to go and grind their herbs in order to make medicine, right? The reason no longer applies. Nonetheless, the Gzera still stands. Generally, that's what we say. Even if the reason no longer applies, the Gzera still stands. Tosfot here, this Tosfot is an earthquake. Tosfot comes along and says, hang on. Says there is a Gzera of clapping and right, making musical rhythms and beats and whatever. But what's the reason why? I mean, he doesn't argue with Rashi on the reason. Okay, that's the reason is Shemai Taken Klei Shiur. That's clear. The prohibition is because you might come to fix musical instruments. But says Tosfot, that reason doesn't apply anymore. We don't fix musical instruments nowadays, and therefore it's going to be allowed. Okay, that's a revolutionary thing. If Tosfot's saying that, so how far do we take this? How far do we extend this? Are we now going to say suddenly that any time there is a gzera, and the reason doesn't apply, we now say the gzera no longer applies. So we generally don't say that. Over here, because Tosfot says it explicitly, so we have what to rely on, and we can, in this instance, right, there is certainly what to rely on here. But it's a big sugya, and it's a big discussion as to how far, whether we can or can't extend this. But the general consensus of the poskim is that unless we have a very compelling proof, otherwise we would not change the halacha. We would not say that even in a case where the reason doesn't apply anymore, we'd say the gzera still applies. Rav Dessler has a piece, not related to this, related to a different case of gzera Chazal, where he says that sometimes, it's only, Chazal only revealed to us one reason why they made the gzera, but there are other, even when it says, Shema yaseh kach v'kach v'kach, but there are other reasons why, and therefore the gzera would still stand. There's another famous case in the Gemara in the first parak of Shabbat. It talks about Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol, right? Where the first parak or the second parak in Masechet Shabbat, where the Mishnah says Lo yikra le'or haner, that a person is not allowed to read by candlelight on Shabbat. This again, this isn't the example I had in mind, but now that I'm saying it, there's another example which comes to mind, which is this: why should a person not read by the light of a candle on Shabbat? So if you know what the candles look like in the days of the Mishnah, they're not like the wax candles we have nowadays, right? So you have this kli kibul, you have this clay container which has oil inside it, and then there's a wick, and the wick draws from the oil. And what happens is when the oil gets to very low, the wick will start to flicker. But if you are going to tilt the candle so that the wick will draw from the oil better, then the light will be sharper. So once had a case, I remember we were somewhere, and the lights went off earlier than they were meant to, around the Shon Shabbat, and the only light, we were sitting and learning, and the only light was a candle. So the question came up, are you allowed to sit and read by the light of the candle. So there, the answer would be yes, because that's not the candle that Chazal were talking about. It's not that we're not saying that the reason no longer applies. It's a different gezerah. It's a different reality. They were talking about a certain specific type of candle. Our candles a wax candle. There's no way you're not going to come and tilt it in order to get the light, and the light is sharp. So that would be okay. But essentially, the Gemara over there says lo yikra la'or haner, and it's right because the Gemara says because we're worried that you might come to tilt the candle. Anyway, and then there's a story of Rabbi Shmuel who says that there's two girsaot there in the Gemara. According to one gives, but according to both girsaot, he says I'm going to read. It says an Adam Chashuv is different because he's not going to come and tilt. But he says, okay, Chazal said you can't tilt, you can't read le'or haner because you might come to tilt the candle. He says I'm not going to tilt the candle, and therefore I can read. So according to one version of the story, he was reading and he wanted to tilt the candle, and he remembered and he stopped himself. According to another version, which the Gemara brings, is that he started reading and he actually did tilt the candle, and then he realized what he had done. So he writes in his pinkas. He writes in his notebook that when the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt, he's going to have to come and bring a korban. That's so that's very, very interesting, Gemara. But what we see from there is that a person can't second guess, and a person can't say, "Well, I know myself. I know this reason doesn't apply to me." Okay, there, it's a situation where the reason actually still applies. Here we're saying if the reality has changed to such an extent that this reason does not apply anymore at all, right? Can we say that the Gzerah no longer applies? So as I say, Tosfot seems to indicate that is the case here in the specific instance, but we would not be able to extend that to other cases where we don't say such a thing specifically. So that's fascinating discussion related to that. Now, what the Gemara wants to say is that okay, but anyway, Tosfot saying that it's allowed in his day, he agrees that in the times of the Gemara it's still going to be forbidden. So the Gemara said, and this is similar to what we saw before. But nowadays we see people clapping all the time. We don't say anything to them. Why not? Okay. Okay, and he's going to say, well, according to your reasoning, we have other cases of people doing things which they shouldn't do. We don't say anything to them. Okay, the Gemara is going to go a little bit back and forth, but ultimately it's going to give us a principle, which is also a very interesting and difficult principle to know when it applies. Halacha l'maaseh, which is what's called hanach lehem nisrael mutav shiur shogagin v'al yu mazidin, which is that sometimes it's better not to give rebuke. It's better that somebody's doing something wrong. Let them do it be b'shogeg. Let them do it unknowingly, than rather than doing it b'mezid, which means that they'll until now they've been doing something wrong and they didn't know they were doing anything wrong. Better they do it without knowing than if you tell them and you know they're not going to listen to you, then they know they're doing wrong and they're still doing it. Okay, but that's the Gemara's going to give a few different cases of that, and it's going to explain where that principle comes in. But that's it. Adkan for today. So have a wonderful day, everybody. Shabbat shalom. And we'll see you all next week.
Shabbat shalom. Rabbi Kenigsberg, I couldn't find the recording of yesterday's shiur.